Few events in World War II were as decisive as the Japanese Empire's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That event marked the entry of the United States into the conflict, which would eventually become one of the major protagonists, and according to many experts, would play a decisive role in the outcome of the war. But was Washington really responsible for the fall of the Axis powers? What would history have been like if the Asians had not provoked the Americans to participate? In this new video, we will learn everything about how that attack changed the course of the war, and we will be able to discover if it actually influenced the final victory of the Allies. Can you imagine a Second World War without the Normandy landings or the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Here we show you.
It starts with an horrific surprise attack, then spreads like a tidal wave across vast stretches of ocean. Before it's over, the conflict in the Pacific launches an entirely new form of naval warfare and sends brave men into battle over crippling terrain.
The attack on Pearl Harbor was the turning point in history, but before we learn about it and construct an alternative ending, we must travel back a few years to understand the scenario that triggered the brutal attacks by Tokyo's forces. The possibility of a war between the Japanese and the Americans dates back to the 1920s, when the former observed the apparent decline of Europe as a world power and saw their country as the natural leader of all of East Asia. However, they identified a long-term threat due to the presence of powerful colonial armies in the region, especially Great Britain, the Netherlands, France, and precisely the United States. Faced with this, the Japanese tried to promote an anti-colonialist sentiment in the region with the slogan of Asia for the Asians, but in reality their thinking was Asia for the Empire, and this was demonstrated when in 1931 they invaded and took control of the Manchuria region in China. Tokyo faced a major challenge in terms of resources for the war, so it needed foreign suppliers to prepare. With that in mind, its expansion plan also sought to dominate territories that would allow it to be self-sufficient. Although its objective was progressing as planned, certain difficulties began to arise.
The new military government heavily increased spending and set Japan on a war footing, with the goal of expanding Japanese influence to the Pacific and Asia, invading China in what would be known as the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. The atrocities in China and the further military buildup made the Western Pacific powers worried.
The battle on Chinese soil was brutal, with ruthless killing and cruel abuse being the hallmark of the Japanese advance. Moreover, they believed that as an Asian civilization, they had a natural right to control the region and refused to negotiate Western demands to withdraw from the occupied territories. This is how sanctions came from the United States, which, in an attempt to stop Tokyo, imposed embargoes on oil and other goods essential to the war machine of the empire. The price to pay for the measure to be lifted was to withdraw its troops from China and abandon the alliance it had already signed with Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany and Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy. Japan understood that this cost was too high and humiliating, so it decided to respond as it did best, with immense violence. Initially, it turned its attention to Europe, where the outbreak of the terrible war offered an opportunity to take advantage of German expansion.
Within a year of the outbreak of World War II, France had been occupied, and most of Europe was under Axis control. Most of the French colonies were administered out of a German puppet state, Vichy French. The Japanese, seeing this, couldn't pass up the chance to gain more influence.
The Japanese Empire began to put pressure on its colonies in Asia and became a major concern for the United States, even though the United States was not involved in the war. By August 1940, American officials had cracked Japanese diplomatic codes, which allowed them to closely monitor their plans. They knew that an attack was coming, and the most likely targets were the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, because it was rich in oil. And other potential targets were British Malaya or the Philippines, a free state associated with the Americans. It never crossed the minds of the authorities in Washington that Pearl Harbor could become a destination for Tokyo's brutality. They did not count on the fact that the government of General Hideki Tojo would ignore advice and remain firm in its decision to attack the Western giant.
In the spring of 1941, 2.5 months after the US oil embargo, Tojo is appointed Prime Minister. His dream is a Japanese empire spanning Asia. Tojo isn't interested in negotiations with the US.
His alternative before having to reach an agreement with the Americans was a preventive air naval operation. The objective was to attack the Pearl Harbor base, located in Hawaii, to prevent the intervention of the Pacific Fleet in the military actions that the Empire of Japan was planning to carry out in Southeast Asia against the overseas possessions of the United Kingdom, France, the Netherlands, and the Americans themselves. For the offensive, 353 Japanese aircraft would be used, including fighter planes, bombers, and torpedo bombers that took off from 6 aircraft carriers. A hell was about to fall on Washington's forces, but still no one imagined that it would happen in this very place.
In early December 1941, the US War Department intercepts warnings of an imminent Japanese attack. But when it comes on the morning of December the 7th, American troops are caught completely by surprise.
The siege began at 7:53 a.m. and lasted 90 minutes. During that time, all 8 American battleships docked in the port were damaged, and 4 of them sank. However, 2 were refloated and 4 repaired, so a total of 6 ships were able to return to service during the war, closing with a total of only 2 losses. In addition, the Japanese attack also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, a training ship, and a mine layer. On the other hand, the Americans lost 188 aircraft, and the number of people who died as a result of the operation was 2,403, while another 1,178 were injured to varying degrees. The Americans considered the operation on Pearl Harbor to be a cowardly attack because the Japanese had not declared war on the United States. However, anger was also due to the fact that the success of the bombing revealed a stunning failure of American intelligence, which increased fears of the country's vulnerability in a dangerous and competitive world. It also led to horrific discrimination against Japanese American immigrants and citizens within the territory. In fact, almost 120,000 of them were rounded up and placed in internment camps until the end of the war. Now, with the objective of preventing a defense by the American fleet fulfilled, Tokyo had the possibility of launching a campaign of expansion in different territories of Asia, including the Philippines, where it wreaked havoc on American forces.
After 4 months of savage fighting, 70,000 US troops and their Filipino allies surrender. Up to 10,000 of them will die on the Bataan Death March before they even reach Japanese prisoner of war camps.
The Japanese Empire once again demonstrated its cruelty, but this time it knew it could have consequences. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the arrival of American forces in the Pacific had intensified. The construction of new ships was advancing, and the United States was preparing to enter a war that until then had been foreign to them. If we look at it this way, the short-term success of the Japanese actions proved to be a serious strategic error. Now it must be ready to battle against one of the greatest military powers in the world, which, despite watching the conflict closely, had not yet decided to participate. The first signs were clear, and the Americans were on the lookout, ready for their revenge.
The Japanese will have their lines of communication and vital shipping lanes under constant monitoring by increasingly aggressive and intrusive American sea and air patrols. American skippers will be given very liberal rules of engagement and were instructed in late 1941 that any heavy air or naval convoy was to be considered hostile. They will be told to use their best judgment when it comes to acting in self-defense, and if that means shooting first, the chain of command up to the president will back you up.
The United States was already involved in World War II. However, the time had come for this story to take another path and to begin to build our alternative future by analyzing what would have happened if the Japanese had not attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The first thing we will take into account for this is the real conviction that existed in Washington to stay away from the conflict. Although that operation by the Asian forces is considered the main reason why the Americans became involved in the war, the truth is that then President Franklin D. Roosevelt had long been looking for any excuse for his country to participate in the battle, and sooner or later that moment would come. The American people remained reluctant to the idea of joining the Allies since World War I had left a bitter taste in their mouths. It failed to be the definitive battle to end all conflicts, and it also failed to make the world a safe place for democracies. Instead, he had enriched the bankers and greedy arms manufacturers, then known as the Merchants of Death, and had done nothing to stop colonial exploitation. However, in 1941, Roosevelt secretly maneuvered to pit the United States against both Germany, which had conquered much of Europe, and Japan, which had seized Manchuria and was waging a fierce war against China. At a meeting in Newfoundland, he told then British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that he would participate in the war, but not declare it, and that he would do everything possible to force an incident that could lead to war. Thus, his open support for Britain against Nazi forces and decision to stop desperately needed exports of oil, metals, and other resources to Japan proved sufficient to accomplish his goal. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt addressed Congress, and it passed its war resolution. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, Tokyo's allies, declared their opposition to the United States, and the world would never be the same. But if that event had not happened, another pretext would have been enough. Sooner or later, the Japanese would reach the Philippines, and the fighting would be the key to strengthening the Allied forces. These types of confrontations could have been the American gateway to the battle, but let us leave this aspect aside for a moment and consider the possibility that had the Pearl Harbor attack not taken place, the United States would never have participated in World War II. One of the clearest examples to demonstrate how the war would have changed is undoubtedly D-Day. Without Washington's participation, the Normandy landings would never have taken place. It was one of the most decisive points in turning the war in favor of the Allies. The opening of an attack front against the Nazis in France caused Hitler's troops to have to divide to face this offensive and the advance of the Soviets from the east. In this way, It not only allowed the recovery of that country from German occupation, but it definitely tipped the balance in favor of the side with the American presence. In view of this, we could say that the absence of the Americans, who collaborated with the training of the troops in Great Britain, and with 73,000 soldiers during the landing, would have meant an enormous challenge for the operation. In fact, it is likely that it would never have been carried out, and as a result, the war would have been prolonged without the certainty of a victory for the Allies. That is to say, that without the United States on the radar, the Axis could have won the war, and the world would be very different today. However, there is also another view of this scenario. Although Washington's intervention was absolutely crucial in the offensive on French soil, experts in the field claim that without its participation, the defeat of the Nazis would have had the same result. This position is due to the fact that when the Americans and the British began their promised front from Normandy, the Soviets had already changed the course of the conflict, and the German army was in full retreat throughout Europe. While it may be admitted that forcing the Führer's forces to fight in two places at once hastened the end of the war, it was not decisive as to who won. One way to put it is to note that, up to that point, the United States and Britain together had faced about 10 German divisions, while the Russians had fought with nearly 200 battalions. Thus, contrary to the American notion, the troops of the Soviet Union deserve most of the credit for victory in Europe, and they suffered greatly in achieving it. In quantitative terms, the 27 million Stalinist fighters who died at the hands of Germany are equivalent to the same number of murders that would be committed if there were one Pearl Harbor per day for 30 years. The war was fierce, and the Western Allies would not have been able to overcome it without the contribution of the Soviet Union. This means that despite Churchill's hatred of the Bolsheviks, the British owe a huge debt of gratitude to the Soviets, without whom they might today have a totally different culture and even be speaking German. However, they also have to be grateful to the United States. If Stalin's troops had achieved a great victory without the American presence, the dividing line between the Soviet Union and the West might have been much more uncertain. In such a scenario, the United Kingdom might have been under a new communist ideology and speaking Russian. Now it is time to move on to the last great unknown of the scenario, in which the attack on Pearl Harbor never happened, and we ask ourselves, what would the world have been like if World War II had not ended with the use of the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Another of the stories that are frequently told on American soil and throughout the West, they say that nuclear weapons were the final blow to the surrender of the Empire of Japan. According to this view, this prevented a massive American invasion of the Asian country, saving millions of lives that would have been lost in a long battle in a humanitarian way. The price of avoiding the deaths of Japanese and American combatants was the death of 166,000 people in the bombing of Hiroshima and 80,000 in Nagasaki. Furthermore, if we take into account the wounded and the people who lost their lives later due to radiation-induced diseases, by 1950, there were 200,000 deaths in Hiroshima and 140,000 in Nagasaki. However, historians claim that there is evidence capable of demonstrating that the surrender of Tokyo was already a fact before the use of atomic weapons. In view of what the Russians had done to the Nazis, the authorities of Japan raised the white flag before terror crossed their borders. Even though they were not necessary, then President Harry Truman, who took office on April 12, 1945 after Roosevelt's death, decided to use the atomic bombs on enemies in the Pacific. It is speculated that the real reason was to send a message to the entire world about America's devastating power, so that no one would stand in the way of his post-war plans. However, all he really achieved was that the planet has since lived under a constant threat of extinction. But without the attack on Pearl Harbor and American involvement, those bombs would never have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war would still end, with Japanese forces hastily surrendering to a Soviet takeover that would mean the end not only of the imperial system, but also of the capitalism that underpinned it. The Soviet Union's influence would likely have been very different from that of the United States. While Washington tried to rebuild the country as a military and economic outpost for Western interests in the volatile Pacific region, Stalin would have brought his communist ideology, as he did to other countries in Asia. In fact, Japan could have become a Cold War battlefield, just as Korea did. Beyond that, the Soviet occupation raises questions about what course it would have taken, since it was brutal on German soil. It is worth mentioning that there was a particular animosity towards the Nazis for what they had done to their compatriots. In any case, the maelstrom of war did not offer any guarantees, since it was a brutal experience, and there were no feelings of pity for the enemy. Returning to the broader picture of the conflict, without the participation of the United States, the Russians would have been the main protagonists of the victory against the Axis, and their influence would be enormous in Europe and Asia. This would prepare the world for a very different Cold War. Perhaps the Soviet Union would even continue to exist and would be the greatest global power. Or in a darker scenario, the Americans, not tolerating such protagonism, would have unleashed an armed conflict where the use of their nuclear bombs would be justified, but now against the Russians. In this way, we come to the end, with the only certainty that if the attack on Pearl Harbor had never happened and the Americans had not been involved in World War II, the planet we live on would be very different. Now, after analyzing all the possibilities that arise from a scenario in which Japan does not attack the American naval base, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us on this journey through these incredible alternative stories. We look forward to seeing you again in our next video.